Hello, my name is Nick Reynolds and I am now going to continue from the last 3 tutorial videos that I put up recently. The first one was on chord tones, the second one was on chromatic passing notes, and the third one was on colour tones. These next 3 that I'm going to do are going to be quite short, and all that they're going to be involving is how to make your playing sound like you're playing one kind of continuous scale. I love Keith Jarrett's playing, and I always feel like when I'm listening to him that he has this kind of sense of this sort of organic way of improvising where it just sounds like a kind of continual scale at certain points. So this will not be looking really at bebop language or kind of Barry Harris stuff or licks or riffs. It's much more of a kind of modal exploration, and it's something I particularly enjoy myself when I'm improvising. So I'm going to stick to the 8 chords that I've been using for the rest of the tutorials. The first one is a C minor 7, and in terms of Autumn Leaves that will be a 2 chord. We then have a 5 chord, we then have a 1 chord, and then a 4 chord. So we're using C minor 7 as the 2 chord. I'm going to use an F7 flat 9 as the 5 chord. Okay. Then I'm going to use B flat major 7, which is a 1 chord, E flat major 7, which is a 4 chord. Then we have an A minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, which is a 2 of the 6 chord, a D altered, which is the 5 of the 6 chord, the 6 chord, and then I'm going to add a G7 altered chord, which acts as a 5 of the 2 chord. Okay, so we've got C minor 7, F7 flat 9, B flat major 7, E flat major 7, A minor 7 flat 5, D7 altered, G minor 7, and G altered. Okay, if you don't know too much about analysing these things, I am actually currently recording this summer a full course, literally from chord tones all the way up to scales and riffs and licks, and I'll be including PDFs and everything, including how to analyse standards. But there are some quite good resources just quickly. Obviously the most comprehensive one being the kind of Berkeley Book of Jazz Harmony, but similarly MDEX Music YouTube channel does very, very good stuff. And this one here, the Jazz Standards Progression Book, basically has the chord function underneath all of the chords of multiple standards, which is a really useful way of learning how to work out function. Autumn Leaves is a reasonably sort of simple progression. I might quickly say, just responding to a comment, that these videos are more for intermediate jazz musicians that know their way a little bit around the kind of modes and arpeggios and jazz. These are not really strictly for complete beginners to it. So what I'm looking for really is, with the constant scale exercise, would be to play the first 4 notes of C Dorian. As I move on to the next bar, what I'm doing is then moving on to the next consecutive appropriate scale. Okay, so when I've got an F7 flat 9, because I'm not using an augmented fifth, I'm going to use a half whole diminished scale from F. So this is going to sound like this, the full scale. This adds a bit of interest to it, because if I just play an F7, it's just a normal 5 chord, and we'll end up just with B flat major. And what I want to do is to show you how it works when we have slightly different scales, which is why I'm going to use some altered scales in here. So, first scale, C Dorian. Then I'm moving into the F half whole diminished scale, but I've got to go to whatever the next consecutive note is, which happens to be F sharp here. Then I'm moving on to B flat Ionian. And then, because E flat major 7 is a 4 chord, I'm going to be moving into a Lydian. Okay, so that's the first set of chords. Now, before I move on, what I'm trying to do is, this familiarises me with basically how to move from mode to mode to mode without really stopping. So I've got this kind of sound. Okay, which means I can then start soloing. I'm trying to do is to get used to moving through these modes without kind of stopping, almost like a kind of continuous scale. So the second half, the second set of 4 bars, I've got an A minor 7 flat 5. Now this is quite important that you make a decision when you're doing an exercise like this, which modes you're going to use. Now for some of them they're obvious. If I was using it, if I had a B flat major 7 and it's an Ionian, then I will use a major scale for the time being. I could use a Lydian if I wanted to create more colour, or I could use a major 7 with a sharp 5, so there's various things. But I would try to keep this kind of very simple and fairly strict when I'm doing this exercise. When I'm actually improvising, I can shift as I want to, depending on what I want to, you know, the kind of different colours that I want to use. So when I'm using an A minor 7 flat 5, I'm now going to use one of the modes of the melodic minor, and in this instance I'm going to use the Locrian with the raised or natural second. So instead of using just a Locrian mode, I'm going to use this raised second, which I just find personally, as a matter of choice, I just prefer that kind of the openness of that kind of, that sound of the second. So that's my choice for the A minor 7 flat 5. The next chord I've got a D altered. Okay, so I'm going to be using a D altered scale. And then the next chord is technically a 6 chord, but I prefer, in terms of this piece, using a Dorian over it. So here I've got a choice of whether I want to use an Aeolian, which has got this kind of slightly closed-in sound and obviously is relevant to the actual key, or if I want to create a bit more of a contrast with that chord, because it's kind of landing as almost like a final chord. So I get that. Because that to me works really nicely to move back into the G altered. So that's kind of like a choice thing, but when I'm doing this exercise, the constant scale exercise, I will first of all work out what is the appropriate mode, which ones am I actually sticking to, and then I'm going to play through them and moving into the next one, whatever the next consecutive step up is. So for the second half of the exercise, A minor 7 flat 5, that's the Locrian with a raised second. Then we've got the D altered. Then I've got a G Dorian I've chosen. And then I've got a G altered. And then that gets me to the next sort of sequence of those 8 chords. Okay. Now on the piano, this there are a number of techniques that I tend to use in terms of memorising these various modes. One of them with the piano is because it is so visual and every single bit of the piano is kind of cut up into these sort of natural octaves. Incredibly different process when I'm doing this on the bass guitar, for example. And if you were playing a saxophone or a trumpet, you have to find your kind of way around it. But with the piano, for piano players, I tend to sort of think about almost like dividing the scale up into kind of 2 regions in a kind of almost visually. So for example, the C Dorian for me is just these sets of notes that I can see. And when I go to the F half whole scale, in this instance, I know I've got these 2 notes here and this block of white notes here. So I've got that, and then you've got these 2. So I can see that all the way up and down the piano itself. That doesn't work in the same way when I'm playing the bass or the guitar, so there are different kind of ways of doing it. But this also helps, and it makes it much easier on the piano because I can visualise it all the way through. So here I'm going to now give you an example of that entire constant scale exercise, and I'm going to start on the note C in this instance. So what you'll notice is when I did that and I went up, okay, if I then continued, I could have continued all the way up to the top, all right, right up to here, or I can just sort of come down again. And what I'm trying to do is just sort of move around that kind of region. Again, on different instruments, you're going to have to think about where the kind of like the highest note is that you want to get to, and then whether you're going to come back down again. Now, the cool thing about this particular exercise for me is obviously I could start, if I started on an E flat, for example, instead of a C or a D or any note, I'm going to have a different phase to that exercise. And it might be, and this is a really good exercise for seeing where your weak points are in terms of, do you actually know your modes properly? Because a lot of people can play each of their separate modes, but to run one mode into the other often kind of trips people up. So if I started, for example, on A of the C Dorin, now I'm going here. So that's the idea, and then what you want to be able to do is then to kind of fluently move through those kind of changes. I found this to be one of the most useful exercises for really understanding the relationship from mode to mode to mode. Also, it's extremely useful when you're playing through pieces like Wayne Shorter compositions, where the chords do not go where you're expecting them to go, and you have very little in terms of like normal standard diatonic progressions. Wayne Shorter always catches you out. He always uses kind of little things where just as you're expecting it to go somewhere, he will shift it somewhere completely different. So when I'm looking at a Wayne Shorter piece, for example, I will often do this constant scale exercise just to sort of like really navigate through the changes that he's actually produced. So that's the idea of the constant scale exercise. The next one I'm going to move on to is what I'm going to call modal interchange, which is a more static version of this particular exercise. Thank you.